A pilot kicked his teen out of first class, but the teen kicked open the doors of power. A pilot kicked his teen from first class, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the teen would kick open the doors of power in response. The moment that shove landed, the cabin's balance of authority flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true strength rises. The flight attendant's pause was too long. Not long enough to cause a scene, just long enough to be felt. As Noel Rowan stood at the entrance to the first-class cabin of Virex Air Flight 611, boarding pass in hand, the man in the crisp blue uniform stared at the seat number with the kind of polite confusion that wasn't meant to be voiced. His fingers hesitated as if translating the code again, as if reading it backward might change it. Noel said nothing. He was 16, tall for his age, composed beyond his years, and well aware that sometimes people didn't expect to see someone who looked like him walking confidently into places lined in leather and champagne. Behind him, Elias Rowan stepped forward. He didn't ask what the problem was. He didn't have to. The flick of the attendant's eyes, first to Noel, then to the seating chart on the tablet in his hand, had already told him everything. Elias placed a gentle hand on his son's back, guiding him forward with the quiet assurance of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading between gestures. "Rowan, seats 2A and 2B, he said in a calm tone. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, for the record and for the room. "Yes, of course," the attendant replied quickly, stepping aside. "Enjoy your flight." The cabin air was cool and still, thick with the hush of engineered peace. First class on Flight 611 was the kind of environment where silence was designed, not earned, where the clink of ice in a crystal glass spoke louder than conversation. Noel walked ahead, placing his bag gently in the overhead bin. He didn't slouch, didn't fidget, didn't hesitate. He moved with the calm of someone raised on expectations, not of privilege, but of precision. His father followed, watching everything. Elias Rowan wasn't a man who announced his authority. He wore no badges or lanyards, but the way he moved, measured, aware, always 2 steps ahead, marked him as someone used to carrying weight others didn't see. His objective today was simple, even if the world insisted on complicating it: deliver his son safely to the International Youth Science Summit in Orvain, a gathering of top minds from across the globe. Noel had earned his seat through work, not wealth, through long nights and harder days. That mattered to Elias, but he also knew, painfully well, that sometimes it wouldn't matter to others. Across the aisle, a man in a gray blazer adjusted his sunglasses and glanced at them. Not long, just a flicker. Then back to his newspaper. Another man, reading something on a tablet, looked up briefly and nodded once, then buried his face back in a digital world. Elias noted them all. Not suspiciously, just as part of the environment. Observation wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Noel buckled his seatbelt, adjusted the headrest slightly, and glanced toward the cockpit door. It remained closed, but a printed notice had been placed near it. Elias leaned slightly forward to read it. In compliance with current Virex Air Policy 47B, Command Image Consistency Protocol enforced throughout flight. The phrasing was familiar, bureaucratic enough to sound neutral, vague enough to mean anything. Elias's eyes narrowed a fraction. He sat down, folding his blazer neatly over his lap. He didn't speak. Neither did Noel. They didn't need to. Their bond didn't require constant narration. Elias watched the crew move through the pre-flight checklist. A young male attendant offered them water. Noel accepted. Elias declined. Every movement in the cabin was quiet, polite, polished. But beneath the quiet, something shifted. The tension didn't arrive like a bang. It crept in like altitude, silent but measurable. It lived in the glance exchanged between 2 crew members up front, in the way the co-pilot murmured something before sealing the cockpit door, in the sudden hush that fell when another flight attendant entered from the galley, scanned the seating layout and paused just a heartbeat too long at row 2. Elias noticed it all. Noel felt it too. He didn't speak, but he sat straighter. He placed both feet flat on the floor. Subtle movements, rehearsed in silence. He didn't know the rules of power, but he knew the rules of being watched. His body obeyed a language passed from father to son in glances and gestures, in years of whispered warnings and careful walks through invisible lines. Across the aisle, someone cleared their throat. Another passenger leaned back and opened a newspaper with exaggerated slowness. Elias's gaze didn't move. He didn't respond. He simply studied. In the row ahead, 2 businessmen in suits exchanged quiet words about the captain, Rourke Halden. "Tightest ship in the fleet," one of them said. "Runs like a control panel." The other chuckled. "Never late, doesn't tolerate nonsense." Elias heard it. He stored the name and the reputation. The aircraft doors sealed with a gentle hiss. The lights dimmed as the safety video began, but Elias didn't look at the screen. He watched the crew. He noted how one attendant, short, with a squared jaw and clipped walk, adjusted his collar twice before taking his position. The other, lean and pale with a crew cut, scanned the rows as if inspecting more than seatbelts. It wasn't fear Elias sensed. It was choreography, like everyone was performing a role that only some were allowed to write. The aircraft pulled back from the gate. Elias placed one hand on the armrest and closed his eyes for a moment. Not from fatigue, but from calculation. The movement gave him space to think, to breathe, to center himself for whatever was forming. He felt the cabin settle into the quiet rhythm of flight, a kind of silence that wasn't peace, just pause. Noel looked to his father, then looked ahead. Their roles were unspoken. Elias would scan. Noel would learn. The plane lifted into the sky with the smooth grace of practiced machinery. Engines hummed low. A steward offered warm towels. Elias declined again, but in his mind, gears turned. Posture, language, authority. Something was shifting already. And as the clouds swallowed the ground below, Elias knew the conflict had already begun, not with a confrontation, but with a glance. A glance that lasted just a second too long. A hesitation that had opened the door to something else. They weren't just flying toward Orvane now. They were flying into a test. And Elias knew that tests weren't always declared. Some came disguised as routine. Some came in the silence between rows. Some came in the form of who was allowed to remain seen. This flight was already descending before it ever took off. Captain Halden paused beside Noel's seat, his frame casting a narrow shadow that stretched across the tray table like a blade. The cabin had quieted after takeoff, the usual murmurs of settling passengers giving way to a lull of comfort until now. The way Halden stood, hands behind his back, eyes fixed not at Elias but at his son, signaled something more calculated than casual inspection. His gaze swept over Noel's blazer, the boarding pass tucked into the side pocket, and finally to his face. "Is this your assigned seat, young man?" Halden asked, his tone even, but sharpened by something underneath, like the edge of a command disguised as a question. Noel straightened slightly. "Yes, sir. 3A." Elias didn't move. His eyes followed Halden's every motion, but his body remained still. He understood the ritual of power, when to rise, when to remain seated. This was a test. Halden leaned forward a little, enough for Noel to press back against the headrest. And how exactly was this seat acquired? Noel blinked, voice steady. "Through my father's ticket purchase. It's part of our itinerary." Nearby, a businessman lowered his magazine slightly. A college-aged boy in the opposite row adjusted his earbuds without pausing his music. The air thickened with polite silence, the kind that listens without intervening. Halden's lips curled into something faintly resembling a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just verifying, of course. We've had some misassignments lately." "That's interesting," Elias said calmly, his voice low but clear. "Then it must be recorded on the manifest." Halden turned slightly, as if just noticing Elias. "Indeed, we'll confirm. For now, I'd like your son to prepare to move. Temporary reassignment." "To where?" Elias asked. "Rear cabin," Halden replied, expression unreadable. "Cockpit discretion." The phrase landed heavily. Elias had heard it before. He knew what it meant, an elastic clause, stretched to cover arbitrary decisions made mid-flight under the banner of authority. It didn't need justification. It was the justification. Noel looked at his father, uncertain. Elias gave him a single nod, not of agreement, but of trust. He wasn't telling him to go. He was telling him not to panic. Noel's fingers tightened around the armrest as he began to gather his backpack. The young man moved carefully, as if every motion had weight, because it did. This wasn't just a seat change. It was something else, something spoken only in the language of posture, timing, and control. Halden turned to the front of the plane and gestured toward one of the attendants, who hesitated. Not outright refusal, but delay. Even the crew sensed it now. This wasn't standard. Elias spoke again, tone even. "Captain, would you mind repeating your name clearly for documentation?" Halden blinked once. "Excuse me?" "For documentation," Elias repeated, meeting his gaze. "You're invoking cockpit discretion to reassign a passenger from a confirmed seat. That requires record, especially when the passenger is a minor." The temperature in the cabin dropped a notch. The businessman put down his magazine. The music in the background was now audible because everyone had stopped talking. Halden hesitated for the first time. "It's standard protocol." "No, Captain," Elias said, standing slowly. "It's your interpretation of protocol." The way he stood was deliberate, slow enough to not escalate, firm enough to shift attention. He was tall, clean-shaven, dressed in quiet authority. He didn't tower. He simply existed in a way that required acknowledgement. Halden turned back to Noel, now standing beside his seat, backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy didn't cry, didn't plead. He waited, still holding on to that nod his father had given him. A passenger across the aisle tapped the record button on his phone, angled discreetly. Elias spoke again, softer this time. "Captain, I won't obstruct your procedure, but I will witness it." The captain said nothing. His authority hung in the air like a badge no one saluted. "This is your final decision?" Elias asked. Halden's eyes narrowed. "It is." Elias nodded once and stepped back, letting Noel walk past him. Passengers watched as father and son passed each other, one retreating from comfort, the other rising into confrontation. It was a transfer, not of seats, but of pressure. As Noel began to walk down the aisle, his shoes made barely a sound on the carpeted floor. The silence around him did more damage than noise ever could. Elias remained still, eyes on Halden, burning the insignia on his collar into memory. Not in anger, but in strategy. The captain turned and followed Noel down the aisle, gesturing again to the same hesitant attendant. But the dynamic had shifted. Authority was still present, but now so was resistance. And in that moment, for those watching, the story was no longer about turbulence in the air. This was not about a seat, but about who was allowed to remain visible. Captain Rourke Halden's hand clamped just behind Noel Rowan's shoulder blade as he gave a sudden push, forcing the boy into the narrow aisle. The overhead lights flickered faintly as the motion jarred the surrounding air. It was not guidance, it was dominance, masked as redirection. The moment was loud, even in silence. Noel stumbled. Halden's polished shoe had clipped his ankle with subtle precision, intentional yet deniable. A small gasp rippled through the rows behind them. Leather shoes shifted against carpeting. A spoon paused mid-air over a meal tray. yet no one moved. Shock had stalled the entire cabin like a dropped curtain in a theater. Noel's hands flailed momentarily before he caught himself against a seat back. His posture froze in place, upright, breath controlled. He didn't fall. That refusal, simple as it was, became a defiant punctuation in the script Halden thought he'd written. The boy looked up once, not at Halden, but at his father. Elias Rowan stood, his motions deliberate and quiet. Not a twitch of panic, not a flash of fury. He rose like a storm that had read the forecast weeks in advance. A slow, silent breath left his chest. The faint chime of a call button nearby echoed like a siren in the sudden stillness. The air itself seemed to compress around the unfolding scene. Halden took a step forward, lips curled into something between an order and a smirk. "Move faster," he barked. It wasn't a request. It was a public display, a signal of who controlled the aisle. Elias spoke for the first time, his voice not raised but unmistakably clear. "Captain Halden," he said, "would you kindly repeat your full name for the record?" The captain blinked, thrown for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," he said, the mockery already loading behind his grin. "I wasn't aware we were recording an audiobook." A chuckle rose somewhere from row 4, uncomfortable and confused. But Elias didn't flinch. He lifted his eyes to the small black dome of the overhead cabin camera. A blink of red indicated it was active. His gaze held there for a moment, silent confirmation, before returning to the man in front of him. Noel had not moved. He stood quietly by the seat row, hands at his sides, shoulders squared like someone holding a line no one else could see. The red welt on his shin was rising now, but he said nothing. Halden took a step closer, trying to reclaim command. "You're interrupting a security discretion decision, sir. I suggest you sit down before—" Elias raised a hand, not to strike, not to gesture, but to request quiet. It worked. "I'm asking for a witness announcement," he said calmly, turning to face the rest of the cabin. "It is within protocol for any passenger to request observation by fellow travelers in a situation involving reassignment or physical redirection. If anyone is willing to act as silent witness, please remain observant and refrain from interference." The language was calm, legal, precise, but underneath it pulsed a declaration: no more silence. Halden bristled. He looked around and saw that nearly every passenger was now watching, phones angled subtly, eyes wide. The performance had shifted stages. He was no longer director. He was the subject. Elias stepped between the captain and his son. Not touching, not threatening, just standing there, a line drawn without chalk or noise. The cabin wasn't quiet anymore. It was held. The captain's jaw tightened. He reached for the intercom control, then paused. He'd misread the terrain. This was no longer about seating logistics. He was being recorded, by passengers, by the aircraft, by a silence that had turned into a verdict. One of the flight attendants, a younger man with tight posture and unsure eyes, took half a step forward before stopping himself. The script was changing too fast. Noel's voice, soft but present, broke the moment. "I'm still waiting for a reason," he said, not to challenge but to remind. "For why I was moved." It wasn't a confrontation. It was an indictment. Elias's eyes stayed locked with Halden's, his tone unchanging. "Would you like to clarify, Captain? Or shall we continue this once we land?" Tension moved like heat in the pressurized space. The walls hadn't shrunk, but they felt smaller. The captain's tongue darted to the corner of his mouth, a tell. He gave no response. He turned halfway, eyes darting toward the cockpit, calculating whether retreat was worse than staying. Elias remained still, arms at his side, voice level, expression unreadable. He didn't need volume. He had something stronger: clarity, position, and 1,000 silent eyes. And the story, once hidden, had just become visible. This was the moment authority mistook patience for permission. Restrain him. The words dropped like a lead weight in the pressurized cabin. Captain Halden didn't shout them. He didn't need to. His voice carried the brittle confidence of a man who assumed authority was its own justification. The command was aimed at the two nearest male flight attendants, who flinched more from the implications than the volume. For a breathless second, the aisle didn't move. Elias Rowan stood still, his posture measured, his eyes calm. The very restraint that unnerved Halden now anchored the room. Elias didn't blink. He looked at the approaching crew members, both young, both clearly uncertain, and spoke with a clarity that sliced through the tension like wire through cloth. "Before you act on that order," Elias said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry, "I advise you to consider Section 14B of the Passenger Conduct Enforcement Guide, page 7, subsection D, Civil Engagement Clause." The nearest attendant, tall, clean-shaven, his badge reading Rallin, hesitated mid-step. His glance flicked toward the captain, then back to Elias. The second attendant, darker-haired, named Trent, stayed rooted in place. The tension snapped from fear to calculation. The cabin knew something had shifted. Captain Halden's nostrils flared. "You're not in charge here, Mr. Rowan." "I don't need to be," Elias replied. "I only need to remind you that unlawful restraint without a clear and present threat constitutes a breach of federal air passenger protocols, especially when the individual in question is standing still and has made no physical threat." Dramatic irony filled the aisle like fog. Halden, so assured in his right to command, was speaking to the man who helped write the very clauses now being quoted. Trent swallowed visibly. "Captain, maybe we should radio the legal." "Silence," Halden snapped. The voice cracked this time. Not with volume, with exposure. Noel watched from the side, eyes wide but dry. He didn't move toward his father. He didn't need to. The lesson was already being taught. Restraint didn't mean weakness. It meant knowing exactly when not to flinch. "I want that man away from the cockpit," Halden barked again, louder now, stepping forward, pointing. "I'm invoking cockpit discretion. I don't need your permission." "And I'm invoking transparency," Elias answered, still unmoved. "Open the cockpit door. Let the record reflect your expression when this is reviewed by oversight." Murmurs rippled through the rows. A man 2 seats back lifted his phone and began recording, openly now. He made no effort to conceal it. "Sir," the passenger said to Elias, "do you want this filmed?" Elias nodded once. "Please ensure the timestamp is visible." Captain Halden's face paled under the cabin lights. "You can't film on federal aircraft," he spat. Elias responded without turning. "You can, if you're documenting potential abuse of authority. See Civil Liberty Clause 2F. More movement, more cameras. A domino of awakenings. Passengers who had kept heads down now sat upright, phones angled, not as weapons, but as witnesses. Silence wasn't loyalty anymore. It was complicity. Halden turned to Rallin and Trent again, but the shift was already complete. They weren't looking at him. They were scanning the safety manual on the service tablet, searching for precedent, hiding behind policy they once used to enforce. "You're making this worse for yourself," Halden hissed. "No," Elias said, finally stepping forward, not toward Halden but sideways, placing himself between the captain and his son without a single touch. "I'm making sure there's a record when you're forced to explain yourself." His voice dropped lower but gained weight. "You ordered a child out of his paid seat. You kicked him. You escalated. And now you're panicking, not because you're in danger, but because you've been seen." Halden's fists clenched, but his feet didn't move. For the first time, authority no longer felt like armor. It felt like glass. "Passenger Rowan," Rallin said cautiously, "are you requesting intervention?" "No," Elias replied. "I'm initiating the first step of procedural accountability. Log my verbal notice. I am formally stating that the captain of this flight has engaged in prejudicial treatment and unauthorized physical redirection of a minor passenger, followed by attempted restraint of a compliant guardian. He turned slightly, projecting his voice to the full cabin. This statement is witnessed. You are all now part of the record. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was responsibility. Halden opened his mouth, then closed it. Words no longer worked. Not here. Not now. The air in the cabin changed. It wasn't cooler or warmer. It was clearer. The theater of command had crumbled, replaced by a quiet courtroom with no gavel and no judge, only light, recording devices, and memory. The captain retreated 2 steps, but the aisle had already become a stage he could no longer control. He gestured vaguely toward the cockpit, but didn't move toward it. He was stranded, not by altitude, but by scrutiny. Noel leaned just slightly, not forward, but into his own posture, shoulders drawn back, chin steady. He said nothing, but his silence now echoed his father's, like a sentence that didn't need punctuation. Elias turned to Rallin again. Log the refusal to open the cockpit. Log the request. Log the hesitation. This is no longer his cabin. It belongs to the evidence. Halden shook his head, more in disbelief than command. You think this makes you a hero? Elias didn't smile. He didn't blink. It makes you explain. And with that, the tension, like cabin pressure equalizing mid-flight, released. Not with a hiss, not with a bang, but with the quiet, irreversible shift of control being taken back, not by force, but by clarity. The aisle didn't feel narrow anymore. It felt documented. Halden turned slowly and walked toward the cockpit, but his steps didn't command attention now. They avoided it. Passengers lowered phones but didn't stop filming. Rallin tapped notes into the tablet with trembling fingers. Trent stood beside Noel like an accidental bodyguard. Elias stepped back into his place, but he didn't sit. He looked around the cabin, then spoke again. This was never about volume. It was always about visibility. And as if marking the transformation permanently in air that could no longer pretend to be calm, he finished with the words that sealed the moment. Power falters when it is forced to explain itself. The announcement was sharp. This is your captain. Due to a developing situation in the cabin, we are initiating a diversion for security protocol. The words were calm, but the intent behind them was surgical, clean, precise, and meant to erase what had just unfolded. The lie slid neatly into the speaker system, an attempt to shift the narrative from misconduct to procedure. Passengers turned their heads in confusion, others in disbelief. Murmurs built like static electricity, uncertain but growing. Some began whispering to one another. Others pulled out phones in silence, eyes flicking between Elias Rowan and the sealed cockpit door. Elias did not move. He sat with his hands calmly folded, legs uncrossed, spine upright. His gaze was not on the captain's voice overhead, but on the cabin crew, specifically the 2 male flight attendants now frozen mid-aisle, unsure if they were to enforce or observe. The shift in their expressions said everything. Authority had fractured. Doubt had entered the chain of command. From the corner of his eye, Elias caught Noel standing quietly. The boy's jaw was set, his chin slightly lifted. Sit, Elias said gently. Noel obeyed, not from fear, but because he trusted that his father's stillness meant something was already in motion. Then Elias stood, slow, measured, each movement precise, like a man remembering his training. He took a step forward, positioned himself between the rows, and addressed the nearest attendant. My name is Elias Rowan, former lead protocol advisor for Aero-Federal Clearance Division. His voice was low but projected, resonating across the cabin like a verdict being read aloud. The attendant blinked. Sir, we were told. I know what you were told. And I also know this aircraft is equipped with automated log systems and dual-angle cabin surveillance. Both are already active." He paused, then turned slightly toward the passengers, making sure his voice carried. "This diversion is not about security. It's about escaping accountability." A beat of silence followed, sharp, cold, undeniable. In the cockpit, Captain Halden's voice crackled over the intercom again, but this time with less force. "Mr. Rowan, please return to your seat. Your actions are being reviewed by ground protocol." Elias didn't flinch. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a slim, laminated credential card. "Review this," he said, holding it up for the attendant and the closest passengers to see. "This ID authorizes me access to federal oversight communications, some of which I've already activated through this aircraft's internal network." He placed the card down on the nearest tray table like a chess piece in check. A flicker of movement, one of the attendants stepped away, muttering something into his earpiece. Moments later, a faint chime sounded from the galley. A coded message had arrived on the crew's monitor. "Independent oversight has been notified. Proceed with protocol compliance. Do not divert." It was simple, unemotional, but its effect was immediate. A wave of uncertainty cracked through the command structure like glass under pressure. The lead flight attendant, a tall man with thinning hair and trembling fingers, looked up from the monitor and locked eyes with Elias. The pilot's voice did not return. Elias turned to the seated passengers, many now recording, others simply staring. "You have just witnessed the difference between a safety measure and a power maneuver. They are not the same." Noel remained upright, his shoulders no longer tight. He looked to his father, not for approval, but for alignment. They were back on level ground. Then Elias turned to the nearest crew member. "I'd like to request that my son's original seat be restored." The words were not laced with bitterness or threat, just quiet, grounded assertion, the kind that doesn't ask for agreement, only acknowledgement. "Yes, sir," the attendant replied almost instantly, as if the tension had finally found its release point. "Right away." Noel stood and returned to his seat in the first row, not as a boy given permission, but as someone who had been wronged and now restored. Elias followed and sat beside him, placing a calming hand on the boy's shoulder, not to comfort, but to signal something had been completed. In the front of the cabin, the cockpit door remained shut. No announcements followed. The aircraft did not change course. It stayed steady, humming forward through the clouds as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The energy inside the plane had shifted permanently. The performance of authority had collapsed under the weight of clarity. Passengers relaxed into their seats, not with relief, but reflection. Something unjust had tried to bury itself in procedure and failed. Captain Halden, somewhere behind that door, had shrunk, not in rank, but in relevance. There was no cheer, no applause, just breath, just movement, just the undeniable presence of truth that no turbulence could scatter. Father and son sat again, not to resume a journey, but to mark the quiet start of something that would follow them long after landing. This was not a victory shout, but a door forced open by clarity. When the wheels of Flight 611 met the tarmac at Velmore International, no familiar chime followed. No welcome message. No polished voice of reassurance over the speakers. Just the heavy sound of engines reversing, brakes groaning, and a sudden stillness that wasn't just mechanical. It was strategic. The captain remained silent. It was the junior co-pilot's voice, thin and formal, that finally cut through the hush. "Welcome to Velmore International. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop." Elias Rowan did not move. Around him, first-class passengers stirred, already unlocking phones, collecting briefcases, murmuring about connecting flights. Elias kept his hands still on his knees. He waited, not out of courtesy, but calculation. When the last row began filing forward, he leaned toward Noel without speaking, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second. Noel understood. The true descent was about to begin. As the jet bridge aligned and the door cracked open, the hush broke with a different sound, the methodical stomp of two pairs of uniformed boots. Two male officers stepped into view, one tall, wiry, and scanning the cabin with studied detachment, the other broader, eyes uncertain beneath the brim of his cap. They didn't smile. They weren't here to help with bags or guide disoriented tourists. They were here to extract. Captain Halden had moved fast. Too fast. He'd filed a mid-air report claiming Elias had disrupted flight operations, citing language like non-compliance, interference, and potential threat to safety. A report crafted for speed, not truth, and it had landed ahead of the plane. The taller officer stepped into the aisle, adjusting his earpiece. "Elias Rowan?" he asked, voice neutral but loud enough to gather attention. Elias stood slowly. "I am," he answered, calm, composed. Then, "Before we proceed, may I have your protocol identification numbers?" The officer blinked, surprised, perhaps, that the man he expected to control was already 2 steps ahead. He hesitated, then reached for a tablet at his side. "Officer Tren, Protocol ID VT9943. My partner is Officer Kalin, ID VT1126. Elias nodded and reached into his jacket pocket. Not abruptly, not defensively, but with deliberate care. He produced a leather case, opened it, and presented a folded credential that shimmered with a blue seal. "I'm a former senior compliance auditor for the Federal Aeronautic Ethics Division. You'll find my clearance and identification numbers here, along with my advisory role on public safety review boards." The officers stiffened, not out of fear, but recognition. Authority had just shifted hands again. From the far end of the cabin, Halden stood half-shrouded in the cockpit door, watching. Elias continued, his voice never rising. "I've prepared a formal statement regarding the incident aboard this flight. It includes exact timestamps, cabin camera references, and relevant passenger testimony. It's signed and notarized." He held up a sealed envelope and passed it to Officer Tren. Noel, standing silently beside his father, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. This wasn't new to him. He was watching the choreography of power, the way control passed not through force, but precision. Dramatic irony clung thick in the air. The officers had approached expecting a disturbance, not a dossier. Officer Tren opened the envelope slightly, skimming the headers. "This references internal flight logs?" Elias inclined his head. "Camera ID 4C, seat corridor footage beginning 5 minutes after takeoff. You'll also find mention of passenger statements recorded during the confrontation. I trust those haven't been deleted." Tren glanced toward Halden's direction. His expression shifted. "We've received the captain's report. However, this changes procedural handling." "Good," Elias said. "I also request that no crew member disembark until they are interviewed for federal statement review, including the captain." That turned heads. The cabin grew tense, passengers pausing mid-step, eyes flicking between Elias, the officers, and the figure in the cockpit. Officer Kalin spoke for the first time, softer than his partner. "Are you pressing charges, sir?" Elias turned toward him. "I'm preserving truth. Whether charges follow is up to your department and the review board." Kalin nodded slowly. Understood. From the seats behind them, someone's phone screen glowed. Then another. Passengers had begun recording. Quietly, respectfully, but clearly. They knew now that what happened aboard this flight wasn't normal. It was a fracture in protocol, and that fracture was being sealed with paper, not panic. Halden hadn't moved, but the edges of his authority were visibly fraying. Officer Tren looked around the cabin and made a decision. "No detainments at this time. We'll log this event for external oversight and begin review interviews immediately." Elias stepped back, offering the aisle to other passengers. "Then I'll wait until everyone disembarks. I'm not in a rush. Truth doesn't hurry." Noel leaned toward his father, barely louder than a breath. "You didn't raise your voice once." Elias looked down at him with quiet gravity. "Because clarity doesn't need to yell when the truth is visible." The video hit the internet like a quiet storm. No punches thrown, no screaming, just the sound of a man's voice, calm, firm, exact, narrating dignity back into a space where it had been removed. Within hours, the footage from Flight 611 had spread across social media, news sites, and aviation forums. Not because of violence, but because of restraint, because Elias Rowan never raised his voice, because his son never raised his hands, because the system was challenged not with anger, but with structure. Passengers who had been silent during the flight, some too stunned, others too afraid, began posting their own accounts. A man in seat 4D wrote a thread on his blog, describing how a father defended his son with nothing but truth and preparation. A teenager who had pretended to sleep during the incident admitted that she watched every second and learned more in 10 minutes than in 10 years of school. Posts piled up. Hashtags surged. And at the center of it all was Elias Rowan's name, though he hadn't spoken it aloud once during the confrontation. By late afternoon, Virex Air's executive board called an emergency inquiry. Captain Rourke Halden was summoned via secured video call. His posture was stiff, his tone overly professional, clinging to phrases like operational consistency and discretionary authority. But the board members weren't looking for jargon. They were looking for distance from the man now threatening their airline's public image. Halden knew it. He tried to reframe his actions as necessary protocol, even using phrases like de-escalation and image protection. But the context had changed. The conflict had evolved. Elias Rowan wasn't just a concerned parent anymore. He was a known name in aviation policy circles. His consulting work with passenger integrity boards, ethics auditors, and flight regulation committees was now coming to light. Legal consultants connected to his former firm quietly stepped in, reviewing the footage, assembling timelines, and preparing for what might follow. Then came the leak. A junior flight attendant, anonymous but verified, sent an internal memo to a journalist. The message outlined Halden's past infractions, 3 in total, each involving mid-flight reassignments of young male passengers based on what was internally described as seat image mismatch. In simpler terms, Halden had a pattern, and Virex Air had ignored it. The board's internal review hit turbulence. They realized Halden had already been warned about this behavior 2 years ago. The warning had been quietly filed, buried under training redirection. Now, that file was public, and the passengers Halden once silenced were starting to speak. Halden sat in his office staring at his monitor, sweating through his undershirt beneath his uniform. He tried to reach his legal advisor, but the call went unanswered. Instead, a message pinged on his screen. It was a link to a news segment. The policy architect who was shoved aside and shoved back quietly. The journalist called Elias a former policymaker turned target of the very system he helped build. They played slowed footage of the aisle moment when Elias stepped between Halden and his son. The segment didn't amplify the tension, it underlined the balance. Watch how he positions himself, not blocking, not aggressive, just present. Elias refused every interview request. He answered no calls. When reporters appeared outside his home, he simply pointed to the statement on his front door. Let the process, not the press, show what happened. Meanwhile, Noel's inbox filled with messages from organizers of the academic summit he was originally headed to. At first, they just offered apologies. Then, they extended an invitation. Finally, they made a bold offer to speak, not just as a student, but as a case study in public dignity, aviation ethics, and the psychology of power. Noel hesitated at first. "I don't want to be known for that moment," he told his father. Elias looked at him from across the dining table. "Then make it part of something larger." With that, Noel began drafting a speech. He didn't focus on the stumble in the aisle or the way Halden barked at him. He focused on structure, on posture, on visibility. "They didn't move me because of my seat," he wrote, hands hovering over the keyboard. "They moved me because I didn't match their idea of who belonged." Meanwhile, Virex's legal team reached out to Elias's representation quietly. They proposed a settlement, a public expression of regret, financial compensation, non-disclosure agreements, the usual escape hatch. Elias declined. "We're not asking for reparation," he told them through his attorney. "We're asking for accountability." "We're not asking for reparation," he told them through his attorney. "We're asking for accountability." The airline was forced to act. Halden was suspended, pending internal and federal review. A press release was issued, sterile and nervous, citing increased commitment to equity and passenger protocol reform. But the story wouldn't fade. Support poured in. Other pilots reached out privately, confessing frustration at similar directives from upper management. Quiet passengers wrote letters. Former employees, long silenced, began posting their stories. The narrative shifted. It wasn't about a first-class seat anymore. It was about dignity, about control, about who gets to decide what compliance looks like. At home, Noel stared at his laptop. He deleted most of what he had written. He kept only the final 2 lines. He stood before his father and read them aloud. "They didn't move me because of my seat. They moved me because I didn't match their idea of who belonged. The question isn't whether you're allowed to rise, it's what you'll do when someone tries to push you back down." The pilot smirked, confident his action would go unpunished, unaware that every witness, every camera, and every executive pathway had already aligned in favor of the teen and his family. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The tribunal room was already full when Elias Rowan entered. No fanfare, no legal entourage, just a black folder tucked under his arm, and the same calm presence that had defined every moment since Flight 611. He walked past cameras and reporters without flinching, ignoring the flashes that tried to attach urgency to his silence. He wore no suit, no pin, no symbolic ribbon. Only truth, and that was heavy enough. Across the room, Captain Rourke Halden sat upright in full uniform, shoulders squared as if posture could still anchor his authority. But the fabric looked heavier on him now, almost burdensome. His badge caught the light but shielded nothing. The panel, 3 men in neutral ties, flanked by a quiet ethics observer, sat ready, the digital clock above them syncing silently with the live-stream timer that blinked red. "Captain Halden," the lead adjudicator began, "this tribunal will review whether your decision to reassign a minor passenger mid-flight on Virex Flight 611 was influenced by discriminatory judgment. You are entitled to a statement before evidence is reviewed." Halden stood slowly, cleared his throat, and began with controlled precision. "My actions that day were based on cockpit policy and safety discretion. I did not, at any point, act with bias or personal prejudice." His voice was steady, but not confident. He looked once toward Elias, then looked away. Elias met his glance without emotion, the way one watches an old clock strike a minute it cannot stop. The tribunal began its review. Screens lit up behind the panel, showing excerpts from the in-cabin AI log, the system designed to timestamp crew behavior and passenger interaction patterns. The first twist came early. The AI report listed Noel Rowan, Seat 2A, as unassigned passenger, boarding verification incomplete. "Explain this discrepancy," one panelist asked. The passenger's boarding pass was verified. Halden shifted. "It's possible the system failed to update due to signal interference." A pause. Then a new voice emerged, a former Virex crew scheduler named Martin Jorlin, appearing via video call. "This isn't the first time. Captain Halden manually flagged passengers on 3 prior flights using a loophole in the boarding input override. In each case, the passenger was either a minor or from a minority background." A murmur rippled through the room. The panelists exchanged quick glances. "And what justification was provided for those overrides?" asked the ethics chair, his tone sharper. "None that held under review," Martin answered, "but they were dismissed as pilot discretion at the time." Elias did not blink. The air thinned slightly when Halden responded, "I don't look at race when I make decisions. I don't even see it." The silence that followed was louder than any rebuttal. One panelist clicked through the flight report, highlighting the name field for passenger 2A. "Your report lists the passenger as unassigned minor, though the manifest clearly states his name, Noel Rowan." Halden swallowed. "That may have been a clerical—" "No," Elias interrupted gently, standing for the first time. "It was a decision." He was not asked to speak yet, but the tribunal allowed it. "Neutrality," Elias continued, "when used to avoid responsibility, is not impartiality. It is neglect." He stepped back. The ethics chair nodded once and turned to Noel, seated to the side. "You may speak, Mr. Rowan." Noel stood. He didn't bring a script, didn't clear his throat. His voice was soft, but clear. I was moved from my seat. But what stayed with me wasn't where I was told to sit. It was why. I'm not here to talk about what hurt me. I'm here to show what it revealed. He paused, letting the words settle like dust on polished stone. Halden leaned forward, mouth opening, but the ethics chair raised a hand. "You will remain silent until called upon again, Captain." The chair turned back to the board. Evidence continued. Time-stamped crew hesitation, Elias's recorded invocation of conduct protocols, independent footage confirming Noel's respectful compliance. The room transformed from courtroom to mirror, each moment reflecting not only what had happened, but what had long been ignored. By late afternoon, the final ruling came. This tribunal formally recommends the permanent removal of Captain Halden from commercial aviation roles due to failure of ethical conduct and abuse of discretionary authority. A gasp rose from the press section, then quickly faded. Virex Air, the chair added, will be fined, required to issue a public apology, and must implement third-party monitored anti-bias training for all command crew. Noel did not cheer. Elias did not smile. He nodded once. Noel leaned over and extended his hand to his father, not for comfort, not for reassurance, but in recognition. Their hands met, firm and still. This wasn't justice granted, it was justice claimed. Noel stared at the envelope on his dorm desk as if it might flicker out of existence. The Virex Air logo, once a source of quiet dread, now seemed oddly formal, even apologetic. He broke the seal without ceremony. No legal jargon, no threats. Just a short, typed letter signed by someone named Marin Kaur, Director of Passenger Relations. It acknowledged the events on Flight 611. It expressed regret. And it ended with the line, "We hope to learn from those who endured what should have never happened." Noel didn't know whether to laugh or tear it up. Instead, he folded it neatly and placed it beside the framed boarding pass his father had mailed him a week prior. That pass, creased, dated, and undeservedly infamous, sat in a black matte frame just above his desk. It was no longer a reminder of pain. It had become a compass. He opened his laptop and recorded a short segment for his podcast, Passenger Row. The tone was firm but measured. Today's episode is not about rage. It's about design, how systems are built to shame without leaving fingerprints, and how some of us were supposed to stay in the background forever, but we didn't. He paused, exhaled, and saved the file. A knock at the door interrupted him. It was Milo Trell, his assigned roommate and a second-year law student who looked more like a bouncer than a scholar. Milo handed him a small package, Noel's name, typed clean across the front. "Mailroom said it looked official," Milo said, then added with a grin, "unless you're secretly applying to run the Department of Transportation." Noel cracked a smile and opened it. Inside was a formal invitation from the Independent Passenger Policy Group, a newly formed coalition drafting updated aviation conduct policies. They wanted Noel to serve as a student consultant. The words felt surreal. "Your experience and clarity are valuable to the structural integrity of our future procedures." His hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down. Elias had always said that systems don't bend to complaints. They bend to architects. Noel walked across campus that evening to call his father. The conversation was simple. "They want me to help write the new guidelines." Elias didn't respond immediately. Then, "Will you?" "I think I have to," Noel replied, eyes scanning the sky. "Otherwise, it all just happened for nothing." Days turned into weeks. The meetings were long, often dry, and sometimes hostile. Noel's first proposal, mandatory training on nonverbal conflict escalation, was met with skepticism by several veteran flight officers on the panel. One, a retired captain named Brennan Core, no relation to the letter writer, scoffed openly during Noel's presentation. "So now we're policing tone and posture? That's a slippery slope." Noel answered, not with anger, but with memory. "No, sir. We're just finally acknowledging that control isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's implied. Sometimes it's the hand that doesn't move, the eyebrow that rises, the silence that follows a name." The room shifted. Another member, a young systems analyst named Darren Voss, nodded and murmured, "He's right. That's exactly where most of the intimidation lives." Over time, the resistance softened. Not entirely, but enough. And through it all, Noel kept the boarding pass within reach. Not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that every word he contributed was tied to something real. Not theoretical, not academic, real. Meanwhile, Elias returned to consultancy quietly, keeping his profile low while his inbox overflowed with federal offers. Oversight committees, review boards, ethics think tanks. He declined most, but accepted a consulting role with the same policy group Noel had joined, quietly ensuring he'd never be in the same room during meetings, but always near enough to catch the tremors if things shook again. Then came the moment that surprised them both. Late one evening, a message pinged on Elias's private inbox. From Marin Core. Subject, personal clarification. "Mr. Rowan, I want to assure you that Captain Halden is no longer employed in any commercial passenger capacity. My understanding is that he's accepted a position with a private cargo transport firm based in Calmora. Off the record, there is no pathway for his return. I thought you should know." M.K. Elias didn't reply. Instead, he forwarded the message to Noel with one line. "They always disappear when the structure doesn't protect them anymore." Noel read the email, then dragged it into a folder titled Noise. His focus was elsewhere now. The podcast gained traction. One episode dissecting mid-air reassignment trends was downloaded over 40,000 times. Requests poured in from university radio stations, aviation groups, and even a high school civics class in Vermont. But Noel didn't want fame. He wanted systems to work. One night, after a panel debate, he returned to his room to find a new envelope on his bed. No return address. Inside, a simple slip of paper with 5 words in neat, angular handwriting. "Still watching. Keep going forward." Noel turned it over. Nothing. He placed it under his keyboard and didn't mention it to anyone. Not even Elias. Later that week, he received a video call from his father. Elias sat in a quiet corner of his home office, wearing reading glasses and holding something out of view. His voice was calm. "I sent you one more thing," he said. A small package arrived the next day. Inside, the original hard-copy boarding pass from Flight 611. creased, faded, untouched. It wasn't the duplicate framed above Noel's desk. It was the actual pass. Taped to the back was a note. This was never about where you sat. It was about why they moved you. That evening, Noel hung it near his desk and sat back in his chair. He didn't look at it often. He didn't have to. Its presence was enough. When Milo returned from class and noticed it, he asked, "Sentimental?" Noel shook his head. Directional. They didn't talk about the flight much anymore. It had become part of the architecture. Silent. Supportive. Always there. But one conversation never faded. Elias had said it quietly during their last visit. They moved you from that seat to shrink you. Noel had paused, then replied with a calm certainty that could only come from experience. They didn't know you built doors, not walls. And then he added, some doors you walk through, some you kick open, for everyone who's still behind them. The panel moderator's voice had just finished echoing through the wood-paneled hall of the Carenfield Civic Auditorium when the air shifted. Next, we welcome Mr. Elias Rowan to the dais. But Elias didn't move. Instead of walking toward the center podium like the others, he rose slowly and turned toward the row of chairs arranged for panelists at stage right. His tailored suit was charcoal gray, plain and firm, his expression unreadable but grounded. The room, filled with policymakers, university scholars, flight regulators, and student advocates, turned their heads in unison. He wasn't taking the keynote slot. He had asked deliberately to be seated alongside the younger professionals. It wasn't humility, it was principle. Noel watched from the fourth row, hoodie sleeves pushed up, pen in hand, recording key moments in the margin of a well-worn notebook. He didn't look up when his father stepped onto the stage. He didn't need to. The panel began with polite formalities and institutional language, mentions of statistical discrepancies, projected reform models, and vague policy ambitions. Then came the moment that cracked the silence. A representative from the Department of Air Transport stood to present findings from a 5-year internal audit. His voice was calm, but his words cut through the atmosphere like a blade. Our review reveals a recurring pattern. In mid-air reassignments due to cockpit discretion, one demographic was disproportionately affected. Young black male passengers were removed from assigned seats at a rate 312% higher than all other groups combined. The hall went still. Elias's jaw didn't move, but a subtle blink revealed what rippled beneath his composure. He lowered his head slightly, as though bracing against a wave he'd seen forming years ago. For a brief second, he closed his eyes, not to rest, but to remember. 3 consulting reports from his past flickered through his mind, each involving passenger disputes he had deemed anomalous or outside his scope at the time. He remembered how he had marked those files. Handled by local review, no systemic pattern evident, close case. Now the pattern stood in front of him, printed and undeniable. A murmur began in the back rows. One young man with a press badge leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "That's his son, right? From Flight 611? Another responded, "Yeah, podcast kid. His last episode just crossed 1 million streams." But Noel wasn't reacting to the buzz. He had underlined a phrase on the printed agenda: passenger dignity and structural power. He kept his eyes on his father, still watching, still learning. After the presentation, one senator stood, her posture confident, but her tone measured. "Mr. Rowan," she began, "if this symposium were to recommend a new advisory board, would your son consider joining us as a youth liaison for future protocols?" Heads turned, cameras angled. Noel's fingers froze on the page. Elias didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his leather folio and withdrew a slim booklet. White cover, Navy seal embossed at the corner. Without a word, he walked down from the stage, stepped into the aisle, and made his way to Noel's row. The room quieted. Noel stood before his father reached him. Elias held out the booklet with both hands. The cover read, "The Passenger Dignity Framework, Draft 1. Noel flipped it open. Printed beneath the title, bold and centered on the first page, was a quote, his quote from the tribunal. "The question isn't whether you're allowed to rise, it's what you'll do when someone tries to push you back down." Noel's breath caught for a moment. He looked up. Elias didn't smile. He just nodded once, an anchor being handed, not a trophy. Then Elias turned, walked back toward the panel, and resumed his seat without explanation. The senator said nothing more. The press took note, but the room itself had already shifted. In that moment it was clear. This wasn't about a speech. It was about a baton passed, quietly, precisely, with weight. Noel sat back down and folded the booklet in his lap. The quote stared up at him like a mirror. The story wasn't over, but it was no longer just his father's to carry. This wasn't about what happened to us. It was about what we refused to let happen again. The email hit Noel's inbox just past midnight. Subject line: Gate A3. Director, confirmation, and schedule. His fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than he meant to admit, rereading the name at the bottom. Kellen Voss. Not just a producer, but a former Virex flight attendant. Not just a witness to Halden's conduct, but someone who had walked away from the airline in silence. Noel clicked open the attachment. A production schedule, interview outline, and beneath it, a message that felt almost too precise. We tell it straight. Or not at all. The studio was minimalist. White walls, black mics, a single row of seats staged to mimic a commercial jet interior. No first class, no assigned rows, just conversation. But the first real challenge wasn't technical, it was philosophical. "If we make this too cinematic," Kellen said during a prep meeting, rubbing his temples, "we risk making pain into a product." Noel nodded, but said nothing. Instead, he his notebook and scribbled, "Truth that doesn't change anything isn't truth. It's theater." Elias, though not present on set, offered guidance through brief calls and quiet messages. One stood out. "Narrative without responsibility becomes entertainment," he had warned, his voice low, clear, unhurried. Noel didn't argue. He carried the line into every scene that followed. When actors reenacted Halden's clipped language, Noel made them redo the takes, not to dramatize, but to downplay. "Real cruelty isn't loud," he told the director. "It's bureaucratic." One afternoon, mid-edit, Kellen approached Noel holding his phone with a look somewhere between alarm and disbelief. "You need to see this." On the screen was a private message forwarded from the docuseries inquiry inbox, marked anonymous, but verified through back-end logs. It was from Rourke Halden. The text was short. No formal greeting, no excuses. Just, "I was wrong. I want to apologize, not publicly, just to him and to his father." Noel blinked slowly. To him, not to me. A mistake or a deliberate attempt to depersonalize? Kellen looked unsure. "Do we respond?" Noel shook his head. "Forward it to my father." He paused, then added, "He'll know what to say." Elias's reply, written from his office desk in measured font, was only one sentence. "You may apologize, but it will not restore what your silence delayed for others." It was sent without fanfare. It would never be printed, but it would be remembered. The series launched 2 weeks later. Episode 1 opened not with music, but with ambient cabin noise, seatbelt clicks, overhead instructions, a faint chime. Noel's voice cut through. Most passengers remember the seat. Fewer remember the pressure. The episode detailed 5 documented reassignment incidents from different airlines, all targeting young men who didn't fit a pre-written mold. Each story was quiet. Each story was brutal. By the 3rd episode, the viewership had reached 3 million. Public comments flooded in, not with outrage, but with admission. "This happened to my brother in 2019. I thought I imagined it. They called me unassigned, too." One reenactment showed a fictionalized passenger, visibly composed, quietly humiliated, being told he had been upgraded, only to be escorted back to coach 5 minutes later. The scene was accurate down to the tone. Passive words, smiling agents, no resistance. Noel narrated, "Reassignment rarely screams. It whispers in excuses." Interviews followed. A young man named Dorian, who had stayed silent for years, finally spoke of the shame that followed him off the plane and into his adult life. Another, Marcus, shared footage he'd filmed secretly of a similar moment, too afraid to post until now. Universities began requesting screening rights. Noel adapted his podcast episodes into classroom discussion guides, aligning them with the Aviation Code of Ethics. Meanwhile, 3 airlines announced open review of their internal reassignment policies. One issued a public apology for an incident Noel had never even mentioned, anticipating exposure. A new phrase began circulating among flight crews and frequent flyers: the Noel Protocol. Initially whispered in crew briefings, it referred to the rising practice of documenting any reassignment order with time-stamped precision, ensuring accountability. Not to shame, but to guard truth. Noel received dozens of messages, some personal, some professional, but the one that stayed with him came from a passenger who had witnessed the Flight 611 incident but had never spoken. It said only this: "You didn't raise your voice, but somehow I heard you." By then, cabin footage had become standard audit material. Airline oversight boards required anonymized quarterly logs of reassignments with racial, age, and name data indexed. Elias consulted on the frameworks but declined credit. The point, he told a journalist, was never to be remembered. It was to make forgetting harder. Late one night after filming Wrapped, Noel and Kellen stood in the fake cabin set alone. Lights dimmed, mics off, seats empty. "Do you think it'll last?" Kellen asked, looking around the quiet studio. Noel leaned against the window prop, then straightened. "Only if we stop asking that," he replied. Outside, headlines began to shift. The series was cited in a congressional hearing about passenger rights. Airports started adding QR code placards in gate areas linking to information on passenger protocol and accountability. But none of that changed how the Rowan family remembered the origin. Noel walked into a university lecture hall 1 week later, carrying nothing but a black folder. Inside it was the original boarding pass from Flight 611, folded once, then pressed flat. He didn't speak about Halden. He didn't replay the video. He didn't reference the docuseries. Instead, he held up the pass and said, "This isn't about a seat." He paused. "This isn't even about me." He looked out across the silent room of students and faculty, future pilots and policymakers, young professionals who had grown up in an age of footage and frames. "This isn't about seats anymore. It's about who gets to remain upright." The boarding pass slid back across the scanner with a sharp beep. Elias Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in alarm, but in instinct. The screen behind the counter didn't flash green. Instead, a soft amber glow appeared, accompanied by a barely audible chime, a different tone, subtle but intentional. The gate agent looked up. Young, mid-20s, crisp uniform but not yet worn in. A flash of hesitation crossed his face before he masked it with a professional smile. He stepped out from behind the counter, holding a small tablet that displayed something Elias couldn't yet see. "Noel Rowan?" the agent asked, eyes flicking to the teenager standing beside his father. Noel removed one earbud, blinking as if surfacing from a deeper place. "Yeah?" The agent nodded, then looked to Elias. "And Mr. Elias Rowan." Elias straightened. His posture never lacked precision, but now it shifted into something more guarded. The terminal was quiet, regional, efficient, without the noise of large airports. Fewer distractions meant more scrutiny. Noel glanced at his father, unsure whether to smile or stay still. The agent extended a hand, not for a handshake, but for acknowledgement. "My name's Jalen Rourke," he said quietly. "I work here as a boarding supervisor." The surname landed like a dropped pin. Rourke, Halden's name. Elias didn't blink. "I see." Jalen nodded once, more measured now. "I'm Captain Halden's nephew," he said, voice even, watching Elias's reaction like someone trained to read turbulence on a screen. Noel tensed. Elias, however, showed nothing. Not surprise, not anger, just calm recalibration. Jalen continued, "I flagged your ticket, for VIP service." Noel raised a brow. "Why?" Jalen paused. His next words were not rehearsed but carried weight. "Not because of your name," he said, "because of what you represent, and because I study your work." For the first time, Elias's expression shifted, just slightly. His shoulders loosened a fraction, not in surrender, but acknowledgement. "I appreciate the gesture," he said. Jalen gestured toward the jet bridge. "I've confirmed your seats. You won't be moved. No surprises today, and no reassignment request will be processed without my override." The terminal's artificial light softened around them. Behind the counter, other agents busied themselves with standard procedure, unaware, or perhaps deliberately detached, from the conversation taking place at the gate. Noel stared at Jalen with the kind of curiosity he used to reserve for men in authority who didn't need to prove they had it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Jalen met his gaze without flinching. "Because I saw what happened, and because I know what silence looks like in uniform." Dramatic irony pulsed quietly beneath the exchange. The nephew of the man who once dragged Noel from a seat now offered him the exact opposite. Not pity, not theater, but presence. Jalen handed them 2 small bottles of water. "It's a short flight," he said, "but if anything happens, I'll be the one to handle it." Elias took the water without looking down. His gaze held Jalen's for an extra beat. Not a test, just a quiet inventory of sincerity. "Your uncle?" Elias asked finally. Jalen looked away for the first time. "He's not in commercial anymore. Left the company after the tribunal." The information didn't linger. Elias didn't press. Noel slid both earbuds back in but kept the volume low now. He didn't want to miss anything else. The 3 men stood at the gate as the final boarding call echoed faintly through the speakers. The air smelled of jet fuel and clean carpet. The boarding bridge was open, empty, waiting. Jalen stepped aside and gestured them forward. "Safe travels, Mr. Rowan." "Mr. Rowan." Elias nodded. Noel offered a half smile. They entered the jet bridge without ceremony. Inside the plane, the air was cooler, recycled, familiar. Their seats were in the middle row, centered, not prestigious, not first class, not even exit row. Just 2 seats together. Ordinary. They took their places without speaking. Noel adjusted his backpack under the seat. Elias folded his blazer before stowing it in the overhead compartment. Neither reached for the call button. Neither asked for anything. Noel looked over, waiting to see if his father would comment. Elias merely glanced back and gave a subtle nod. Noel nodded in return. And then they sat, untouched by protocol, unseen by suspicion, unburdened by fear. It wasn't about where they sat. It never had been. It was about being allowed to sit without explanation. The plane door sealed, engines hummed to life. And as the flight prepared for takeoff, Elias finally leaned toward his son and spoke, just loud enough to be heard over the engine. "This time, we boarded without proof, and that's what progress looks like." On a quiet morning, the projector remained off, and no slides flickered across the whiteboard. Noel Rowan stood at the front of the tiered lecture hall, holding nothing but a single, slightly faded boarding pass between his fingers. The room was filled with second- and third-year aviation law students, some still yawning behind coffee cups, others poised with digital tablets ready. Yet, for all their preparation, none were quite ready for how the lecture would begin. "What's the price?" Noel asked, raising the pass slowly into view. "Of pushing someone back one row?" Silence. Not the kind born from distraction or indifference, but the kind that arrives when a question feels like a scalpel. Several students lowered their pens. Others shifted in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing the start of a case study or a confession. He didn't wait for answers. He placed the boarding pass on the table beside him, but did not release it. His fingers hovered just above the card like it still carried static from the past. "I won't name the airline," he said. His voice was calm, measured, deliberate. "I won't mention the flight number either. I won't show the video. I won't play the audio recordings. I won't describe what the captain looked like or even say what seat I was supposed to be in." A few glances darted across the room. Everyone knew. Most had read the transcripts, maybe even posted about it when it went viral. But here, in this room, Noel wasn't letting the spectacle do the work. "I'm not here to give you a headline," he continued. "I'm here to give you a structure." He stepped closer to the edge of the podium. Imagine a moment where everything appears orderly, professional, normal. Now, imagine that order being used not to protect people, but to reposition them. He paused. Just slightly, just one row. The boarding pass shifted as his finger tapped it lightly. "One row," he repeated. "That's all it took. Not because of a mistake, not because of overbooking, but because someone with a badge decided that silence should match appearance, that hierarchy should match comfort." From the back of the room, arms crossed, Elias Rowan watched. He didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. His presence wasn't ceremonial. It was watchful, protective, proud. Students began sitting straighter now. The ones who wanted bold case law citations were facing something quieter and somehow more difficult: truth without performance. "Aviation law isn't just about skybound contracts and regulatory codes," Noel said. "It's about what's invisible when the cabin doors close." A hand raised timidly. A student asked, "But why didn't you file a lawsuit for damages? You could have won." Noel smiled gently. "Because sometimes the damage isn't financial. It's structural. And sometimes the real power isn't in punishing someone. It's in changing what gave them permission in the first place." He looked down at the boarding pass again. A memory flickered in his eyes, but it passed. "This," he said, holding it up, "isn't a symbol of loss. It's a record of where someone tried to shrink me." More hands raised, but he didn't call on them. Not yet. "Do you know the part that stayed with me most?" he asked. "It wasn't being walked down the aisle. It wasn't the stumbling or the eyes watching. It was the moment my father stepped between us, not to fight, but to be seen, to make sure I wasn't reduced quietly." He let the pause stretch. "Discrimination rarely enters with shouting," he said. "It arrives in tone, in glances, in policy clauses that leave just enough room for someone to act on bias and call it discretion." He paced once across the floor, slow and purposeful. "The structure didn't break that day," he said. "It revealed itself." One student, a tall young man seated near the center, leaned forward. "Do you think it would have happened if you were older? Or dressed differently?" Noel answered without hesitation. "It didn't happen because of how I looked. It happened because someone thought I wouldn't push back." He held the pass again, this time lowering it to the desk. "And because pushing someone down feels easier when you think no one will ask why." The room was fully still now. Even the students who usually texted under the table had gone still. "I'm not interested in making this personal," he said, "because the moment you make it about one man, one flight, one crew, it becomes easy to dismiss as an exception. He picked up the boarding pass again and looked at it like one might look at a photograph rescued from a fire. Then he added, quietly but clearly, "My objective isn't memory. It's transfer." At that, a hand slowly reached out toward the boarding pass. Noel saw it and paused. A flicker of smile reached his face, not of mockery, but of recognition. He pulled the pass gently back and said, "Some seats are earned, others are inherited, but the ones you fight for, those are doors. And when you kick those doors open, make sure they never close behind you again." Seconds later, the teen's actions exposed the pilot's arrogance, turning the cabin and the airline upside down, leaving the crew frozen in shock. If you believe real authority strikes decisively, with precision, foresight, and unyielding power, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, arrogance, and the consequences of underestimating others. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, accountability, and standing up with integrity.